Stalin's trial against me is built upon false confessions, extorted by modern inquisitorial methods in the interest of the ruling clique. A counter-trial is necessary to cleanse the atmosphere of the germs of deceit, calumny, falsification, and frame-ups whose source is Stalin's police, the GPU, which has fallen to the level of the Nazi Gestapo.
Lev Davidovich Bronstein, most commonly known by his pen name Leon Trotsky, was born to a wealthy Jewish farming family in Russia in 1879. He did his studies in Odessa and first joined the Narodniks in 1896, before converting to Marxism and joining the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, the RSDLP, in 1898. As the RSDLP grew, so too did the need to refine its theory and the quality of its membership. Questions on the revolutionary classes of Russian society, on how to organise the party, and on the nature of the approaching revolution became more and more urgent. The leader of the Bolshevik faction within the RSDLP, Vladimir Lenin, recognised that the proletariat was not the only revolutionary class in Russian society. The poor peasantry and the oppressed nations of the Russian Empire could also be convinced to join the proletariat in revolutionary struggle. This would enable the proletariat to become the leading revolutionary class of both the bourgeois and proletarian revolutions, build and develop the economic productive forces, and implement a dictatorship of the proletariat without the need to wait for a revolution in the advanced capitalist nations of Western Europe. Trotsky opposed every single one of these views, making him an anti-Leninist figure throughout his political career, who consistently sided against Lenin both on questions of ideology and organisation. Ideologically, Trotsky developed his competing theory of permanent revolution alongside Alexander Pavus and based on his writings. Pavus was a member of the Social Democratic Party of Germany and an opportunist who would later be refused entry into Soviet Russia by Lenin with the famous message, "The cause of the revolution should not be touched by dirty hands." Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution opposed Leninism in various ways. Firstly, it argued that without a proletarian revolution in the advanced industrial nations of Western Europe, a socialist project was doomed to fail. Trotsky believed that only the proletariat could be considered a revolutionary class in feudal Russia, dismissing the poor peasantry as petty bourgeois and the oppressed nations as bourgeois. He therefore believed that the forces to achieve and sustain a proletarian revolution in Russia were too few without the support of the advanced proletariat of Western Europe. This belief inevitably led to the demand for simultaneity, or revolution in many different countries at once, as a necessary precondition for socialist advance. This prompted defeatist and nihilistic attitudes towards the first workers' states, including the Soviet Union, with Trotsky not only predicting that socialist economic construction would fail at every step, but that the dictatorship of the proletariat would degenerate as an inevitable result of its isolation. Of course, something comparable did occur in the Soviet Union, under Nikita Khrushchev and his successors, and capitalism and imperialism do remain a constant threat. But as the workers' states in the modern world have shown, the temporary setbacks were far from inevitable, and were only accelerated by Trotsky and his supporters. Trotsky's views never found much support within the Bolshevik Party itself. Instead, the position that prevailed in the party apparatus was that of Lenin and Stalin's socialism in one country, asserting that the foundational elements of a socialist economy could be developed without revolutions in Western Europe. As Stalin explained, what is permanent revolution in its Trotskyist interpretation? It is revolution that fails to take the poor peasantry into account as a revolutionary force. Trotsky's permanent revolution is, as Lenin said, skipping the peasant movement, playing at the seizure of power. This explains the struggle that Leninism has been waging against Trotskyism ever since 1905. Organisationally, Trotsky supported the Menshevik view that the party could be broad, mass-organized of self-enrolling members and competing factions, as opposed to the Bolshevik view of a disciplined, centralized organization united in revolutionary struggle. This led Trotsky to oppose the Bolshevik-Menshevik split and the founding of the Bolshevik Party in 1912. Trotsky even accused Lenin of imposing a dictatorship, arguing that Lenin's iron hand would lead the party organization substituting itself for the party, the Central Committee substituting itself for the party organization, and finally, the dictator substituting himself for the Central Committee. This became actively harmful when it came to Trotsky's August Bloc, an alliance of various opportunists, liquidators and Trotskyists all uniting to ensure that the revolutionary Bolsheviks and the counter-revolutionary Mensheviks remained tied together. Where Lenin viewed the destruction of the August Bloc as a necessary precondition for the party's development, Trotskyism believed the liquidationist faction was a vital part. It would take many years for Trotsky to abandon this position, as he tended to change his views based on whatever served his own narrow interests at that particular moment in time. As Lenin writes, "The only thing he does have is a habit of changing sides, of skipping from the liberals to the Marxists and back again, of mouthing scraps of catchwords and bombastic parrot phrases. But the liquidators and Trotsky, who tore up their own August Bloc, who flouted all the decisions of the party, and disassociated themselves from the underground as well as from the organised workers, are the worst splitters. Fortunately, the workers have already realised this, and all class-conscious workers are creating their own real unity against the liquidator disruptors of unity." Trotsky continued to oppose Leninism throughout World War I. Where Lenin advocated for the defeat of their own Tsarist Russian government during the inter-imperialist war as a first step towards class war and the socialist revolution, as well as a complete break with the opportunist Social Democrats of the Second International, who advocated for the victories of their own countries, Trotsky instead promoted his own slogans of neither victory nor defeat, and peace without indemnities or annexations, peace without conquerors or conquered. Addressing this position of unprincipled peace and unity with imperialist socialists, Lenin wrote that Rakovsky and Trotsky too are, in my opinion, all the most harmful Trotskyists, inasmuch as they all, in one way or another, are in favour of unity with the opportunists. In the years that followed, the Bolsheviks were hard at work building their party and preparing and organising the working class and peasantry for the historic Russian Revolution. Meanwhile, Trotsky spent the years between 1912 and 1917 as a journalist, travelling across Western Europe and the United States, and continuing to undermine Leninism and Bolshevism with his writings. Reflecting on this period, Trotsky himself admits, "The deep differences that divided me from Bolshevism for a whole number of years, and in many cases placed me in sharp and hostile opposition to Bolshevism, were expressed most graphically in relation to the Menshevik faction. My, quote, conciliationism led me at many sharp turns in the road into hostile clashes with Bolshevism." It wasn't until May 1917, after the Tsar had been overthrown in the February Revolution, and a few months before the Bolsheviks would take power, that Trotsky finally returned to Russia. And even then, Trotsky did not join the Bolsheviks outright, but instead joined the Mezrayantsi group, who supported Bolshevik-Menshevik unity right up until the Bolshevik Revolution. After abandoning this position, the Mezrayantsi merged with the Bolsheviks at the 6th Congress of the RSDLP. Although Trotsky never fully abandoned his Menshevik views, nevertheless, after the Bolsheviks gained a majority in the Petrograd Soviet in October, Trotsky was elected as its chairman. Trotsky would always overstate his contributions to the October Revolution. Immediately after Lenin's death in 1924, he would write Lessons of October, in which he would paint himself as the leading figure in the Russian Revolution, in order to stake his claim for the party leadership. Stalin responded to this as follows: "I am far from denying Trotsky's undoubtedly important role in the uprising. I must say, however, that Trotsky did not play any special role in the October uprising, nor could he do so. Being the chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, he merely carried out the will of the appropriate party bodies, which directed every step that Trotsky took. This, of course, does not mean that the October uprising did not have its inspirer. It did have its inspirer and leader, but this was Lenin, and none other than Lenin. After the Bolshevik Revolution, Trotsky was then made the People's Commissar of Soviet Affairs, putting him in charge of the Brest-Litovsk peace negotiations with imperialist Germany at a time when no pan-European revolution had emerged, and the young Soviet Republic was in desperate need of respite from the war. But, at a crucial moment in the negotiations, Trotsky declared unilateral withdrawal of the Soviet Republic from the war and the demobilization of the Russian army acting against the wishes of the Party Central Committee and the Soviet government. He then left Brest-Litovsk on the basis that, quote, "We can only be saved in the true meaning of the word by a European revolution." As Lenin said later, this gave the German command the pretext to sign a much more humiliating peace, and the blame for this rests on those who refused to accept former peace, meaning Trotsky. Lenin criticized Trotsky severely for this breach of discipline, rooted in his defeatist beliefs in permanent revolution, stating that, quote, "If you are unable to adapt yourself, if you are not inclined to crawl on your belly in the mud, you are not a revolutionary, but a chatterbox. And I propose this not because I like it, but because we have no other road, because history has not been kind enough to bring the revolution to maturity everywhere simultaneously." After this failure, Trotsky resigned as Commissar for Foreign Affairs and was appointed People's Commissar of Army and Navy Affairs instead, putting him in control of the Red Army. In the years that followed, Trotsky's behaviour was mainly defined by his factional organising, his self-aggrandizement within the party, and his attempts to secure a path to the leadership in opposition to Stalin. This increasingly hampered the party's work at a time when the strength of the party, and through it, the strength of the dictatorship of the proletariat, was vital to build and defend the new workers' state from aggression at home and abroad. In response to the anti-Leninist factions vying for control within the party, most significantly Trotsky's, Lenin implemented a ban on factions at the Bolshevik Party Congress in 1921. The next year, the 11th Party Congress created the new position of General Secretary, and the party leadership overwhelmingly voted to appoint Stalin to this position. As Lenin's health deteriorated following multiple strokes, Trotsky's attacks on the leadership of the party intensified, and in 1923, Trotsky sent a letter to the Central Committee claiming that the party leadership was leading the country to catastrophe and demanding greater inner-party democracy, meaning the right to undermine the dictatorship of the proletariat through factional organising. Trotsky and 46 of his followers submitted a manifesto to the leadership known as the Statement of the 46, which was overwhelmingly voted down. Trotsky then wrote a letter complaining about the degeneration of the old Bolsheviks of the party. Stalin responded to this attack with his own, stating that there are a number of elements within our party who are capable of giving rise to a real danger of degeneration of certain ranks of our party. I have in mind that section of the Mensheviks who joined our party unwillingly, and who have not yet got rid of their old opportunist habits. After Lenin's death in 1924, Stalin was democratically appointed to the position of leader, and Trotsky continued his opposition to Leninist politics under the guise of support for Leninism against Stalin. Trotsky's arrogance led him to believe that he represented the true working class current within the party, while Stalin's base of support lay somewhere between the working class and the petty bourgeoisie. For this reason, he called on the party to introduce more factory workers into its ranks, believing it would build support for himself. The party happily did this in 1924 under the so-called Lenin levy, but this only boosted support for Stalin, who was overwhelmingly popular among the industrial proletariat. Following his removal from the post of People's Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs in 1925, as a response to his opposition to the party and its leadership, Trotsky became the central figure of an opposition current within the all-Union Communist Party, Bolsheviks, alongside Zinoviev and Kamenev, who, despite former disagreements, were all united in their belief that building socialism in the newfound Soviet Union was impossible. Together they formed the New Opposition, which attacked the possibility of building socialism at the 14th Congress, but was resoundingly defeated. With the collapse of the British general strike in 1926, which they of course blamed on Stalin's leadership, the New Opposition produced a factional platform and tried to organise anti-government factory demonstrations, which were overwhelmingly opposed by the workers. Having failed at their attempt to split the party, they were forced to admit defeat and wrote a statement promising to desist from factional activity in the future. But this was insincere, and in truth, Trotsky's bloc had already organised its own illegal party, with its own membership system, a secret illegal printing press, and secret meetings around their opposition platform. In October 1926, the Central Committee issued a severe warning for this activity and removed all 3 leaders of the opposition faction from positions of power. Their platform was denounced as a brand of Menshevism, and they were warned that they would be expelled if they persisted. But persist they did. In 1927, Trotsky's faction renewed their attack on Stalin's leadership, again blaming him for a revolutionary setback in another country. This time, the failure of the Autumn Harvest Uprising in China. Trotsky's view again, rooted in his failure to realise the revolutionary role of the peasantry, was that organising the peasants in armed struggle was, quote, the perspective of a terrific debacle and opportunist degeneration of the remnants of the Communist Party of China. According to Trotsky, the CPC's rising peasant membership was a menacing process, and under no circumstances could peasant war be substituted for the dictatorship of the proletariat. Of course, if Mao Zedong had listened to Trotsky, one of the most important revolutions of the 20th century would not have taken place. Nevertheless, Trotsky capitalized on his temporary retreat of the revolution in China to issue a platform of the joint opposition on behalf of his faction. Again, this platform found no support and was withdrawn by Trotsky with another written apology, before yet another violation a month later. After repeated warnings and repeated breaches of discipline, the Central Committee was forced to expel Trotsky and Zinoviev from the party in October. It is worth noting that at the party's 15th Congress, 724,000 members voted for the Central Committee's programme, while a measly 4,000 voted for Trotsky and Zinoviev. Gaining almost no support within the party, Trotsky's faction once again organised some poorly attended anti-party demonstrations, this time on the 10th anniversary of the October Revolution, on the 7th of November 1927. Having proven their open hostility to the dictatorship of the proletariat and the Soviet government, Trotsky and Zinoviev were expelled from the party on the 14th of November, followed by a number of their supporters, although those that recognised their errors and agreed to break with Trotskyism were restored to party membership. In January 1928, Trotsky was exiled to Alma-Ata in modern-day Kazakhstan, where he continued to indulge in anti-party and anti-Soviet activity. This was the year that Stalin ended the NEP and began implementing the country's first 5-year plan, having successfully facilitated the transition from war communism to the beginnings of a socialist system. Trotsky now attacked its abolition on behalf of the kulaks, demanding that these landlords not be abolished fully, but that they instead introduce, quote, a policy of severely restricting their exploiting tendencies. Finally, in January 1929, Trotsky was expelled from the Soviet Union. Trotsky spent the last decade of his life continuing his anti-communist writings and attempting to gain followers from exile. He started with his autobiography, My Life, where most revolutionaries do not have the time for something so self-indulgent as an autobiography. Trotsky nevertheless felt that this was his most pressing task. When it was finished, Trotsky's small handful of supporters gave him many accolades for the text, not least of all Adolf Hitler. Hitler's biographer, Konrad Hayden, tells in Der Führer how the Nazi leader read it as soon as it was published and surprised a circle of his friends in 1930 by bursting into rapturous praise of Trotsky's book. Then in 1935, Trotsky wrote the thesis which would later become The Revolution Betrayed, predicting the, quote, inevitable collapse of the Stalinist political regime and its replacement by a fascist capitalist counter-revolution, unless the Soviet leadership was overthrown by a Trotskyist coup, and that Stalinism and fascism are symmetrical phenomena, which in many ways show a deadly similarity. The reality was the opposite, and this book would become a key weapon in the arsenal of the Nazis' chief propagandist, with Goebbels excitedly telling Germany's socialists and communists, "See, what Trotsky is saying about the Soviet state is no longer a socialist state, but a state dominated by a parasitic bureaucracy living on the Russian people." Clearly, Stalin's statement that Trotskyism had long ago moved from being a mistaken trend of the workers as movement to one which was actively supported and promoted by imperialism and imperialist intelligence, as well as the immediate fascist threat, was proving more and more true. But even in The Revolution Betrayed, Trotsky was forced to recognize the vast achievements of the Soviet Union under Stalin's leadership, obviously with the implication that it would have been even better if only he was the leader instead. But also that despite all the achievements of socialist collectivization under Stalin, the Soviet state in all its relations is far closer to a backward capitalism than to communism. Once again, Trotsky called for a second supplementary revolution against bureaucratic absolutism, led by Trotskyists against the elected Soviet leadership. Although he continued his paradoxical claim that the revolution would fail anyway, without the victory of the revolution in the rest of Europe. In order to promote his views and gain more followers, Trotsky established the International Left Opposition, ILO, in 1930 in an attempt to create a factional opposition within the Communist International, or Comintern. This was an utter failure, as members of the ILO were simply expelled. Having failed to infiltrate the Comintern, Trotsky then supported the tactic of Entryism. This tactic, which would later become a hallmark of future Trotskyist groups, meant getting small groups of his followers to enter a socialist or communist party, disseminate their own propaganda, and criticize its policies in the hopes of recruiting new members before they inevitably become purged. The first attempt at this tactic was during the so-called French Turn in 1934. After the downfall of the Daladier government in France, French socialists and communists feared that fascists would seize power as they had done in Germany and Italy. The Socialist Party, SFIO, and the Communist Party, PCF, therefore formed a united front. At this time, the Trotskyist Communist League, the French section of the ILO, was a small and mostly middle-class organisation, and Trotsky planned not to mobilise his supporters in the struggle against fascism, but instead to infiltrate the Socialist Party and recruit. Having failed to influence the party after several splits over disagreements with Trotsky and his tactics, the French Trotskyists staged a humiliating withdrawal in 1936. Despite having only a handful of followers worldwide, Trotsky then worked to establish a rival organisation to the Comintern, known as the Fourth International, which was founded in 1938. The programme adopted by this organisation, titled The Death Agony of Capitalism and The Tasks of the Fourth International, but more commonly known as Trotsky's Transitional programme, will be addressed in a future video. But suffice it to say that it was presented as a critique and alternative to the strategic line of the Comintern, and despite its structural flaws, is still replicated by many Trotskyist groups today. In 1939, when the Soviet Union intervened in Poland and Finland, Trotsky insisted that one could criticize the Soviet Union while calling for its unconditional military defense. This was obviously hypocritical, since he had spent his whole life struggling against the communist movement as it actually existed, and provided tacit support for its defeat by capitalist and fascist forces worldwide. Indeed, as the war against fascism was raging, Trotsky repeatedly predicted the defeat of the USSR and the triumph of Hitlerite Germany, stating that Stalin cannot wage an offensive war with any hope of victory. The present war can crush the Kremlin bureaucracy long before revolution breaks out in some capitalist country. Trotsky did not live to see the heroic victory of the Red Army over fascism, the spread of the revolution across 1/3 of the globe, nor the greatest assault against capitalism and imperialism the world had ever known. After a lifetime of discredited theories, of organising against a socialist society that he could have once have helped build, of attempting to disrupt and demoralise the socialist and communist movement worldwide at the height of the fascist threat, Trotsky was murdered with an ice axe at his home in Mexico by Spanish communist Ramon Mercader. It is our opinion that history had already rendered its verdict on the political project that Trotsky represented.